To conclude our section on setting up the scene, we'll talk about how adding props and accents around your plate can add real depth to your scene. We'll talk about what accents are and how they can be used. We'll learn how accents add information to your scene. And we'll also look at a handful of different types of accents and how they can be used to add more depth and meaning to your scene. So what are accents and props? And when I use those two words, accents and props, I pretty much use them interchangeably. They're both elements that go under or above or around your plate to help set up your scene. They add a lot of depth and dimension. They help you tell a better story, which we've talked about many times and how crucial that is. And they also add descriptive information. So if you look at this sushi over here, at first look, it almost looks like regular sushi, but there's a pineapple in the background. That pineapple adds depth, it helps tell the better story, and it adds descriptive information because this sushi is not regular sushi, it's dessert sushi with a pineapple date filling. So notice how that pineapple adds a lot of depth, tells the story of this tropical theme, and it gives a lot of descriptive information. So that's one of the crucial things that props can do for you, is they can add information to your scene. They help viewers immediately understand what's going on when it wouldn't otherwise be obvious. So as you're setting up your scenes, it's important to ask yourself, is it immediately obvious what's in this scene? And if it's not, add a prop that describes it. So if you look at this scene to the right, this is cashew milk. Now, if we just had the cashew milk by itself and we asked ourselves, is this immediately obvious what's in the scene? The answer would definitely be no, because there's no way to distinguish the cashew milk from soy milk, from almond milk, from cow's milk. But when we add the cashews to the scene, then it becomes immediately obvious that this is cashew milk. And I liked this so much that I actually made the cashew the focus of the scene as opposed to the milk, because I thought it told a much better story than just the white liquid in the cup, which could be anything. So using props to add information is probably the most important thing they can do for you. Next, we're going to look at a number of different accents and elements that I often use in my pictures to add depth. These are permanent things I often have around my house specifically for food photography, whereas in the previous slide we looked at how we can use unique elements like the cashews or like peanuts for the molasses peanut butter cookies we looked at several times, different descriptive elements that are specific to the scene. What we're going to look at now are more permanent things that can add depth, and the first of those are napkins and textiles and fabrics. The best way to use these is you have your surface, which we talked about in the last lesson. You put one of these napkins on your surface, and then you put the plate on top of the napkin. So if you look at this banana coconut chia pudding, the surface is actually a burlap surface, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But on top of that surface, you see there's the jaggedy yellow and white napkin. And then on top of that, we have our bowl of pudding. So this picture would be very bland and very simple if we just had the brown bowl on the brown surface. But when we add the layer of the napkin, it adds so much depth and makes this picture shine, whereas it otherwise would have just blended into the background. So these are something I use in probably 50 to 75% of my shots. They add so much value for maybe $2 or $3 each. And even though I use them a lot, what you see in the picture is actually all I have. I have 6 that are very versatile. They can be used under many circumstances, with many types of dishes, and on many types of surfaces. So if you can, build a small collection of 3 or 4 napkins that you can find at like Bed Bath & Beyond or other home good type of stores. Another fabric that I've been using a lot is burlap. And this happened because I saw a lot of food photographers using this fabric, and being a 26-year-old guy, I had no idea what it was. So I showed pictures to my mother, and I was like, hey, what is this? And where do I get it? And she told me it was burlap, and I could find it at a fabric store. So I went to the fabric store, and to my surprise, they had about 10 or 12 different kinds of burlap, different sizes and different colors. So I got some white and some green and some brown. And these actually work well as surfaces, which we talked about in the last video. You can put a whole tabletop of this, put your food on top of that, and it looks really nice. But I also cut out small squares, like you can see in these cookies. They add a really nice rustic feel, and I find myself using burlap a lot. It works well under many circumstances with many types of food, and it's a really nice accent to have access to. So go to a fabric store, get a small piece of burlap for $1 or $2, and it'll go a long way towards helping you take better pictures. Another thing I often use are kitchen towels. These are like 50-cent towels that you can buy anywhere, and they work really well under certain circumstances to add a sense of realism, as if there's a towel over your shoulder, you're cooking, you set the towel down, and you snap some pictures. And that kind of a feeling and that kind of a story can work really nice in some circumstances. So if you can, add a few kitchen towels to your collection. They're very cheap, very flexible, and they work really well under the right conditions. When I first started off, I used placemats a lot, and the reason I did this was because I didn't know all the information I knew about surfaces, which we just talked about. So I used placemats in place of the surfaces, like the wooden surface or the foam boards or the chalkboards. I would buy 2 or 3 of them and then set them up next to each other, like you can see here. This is the bamboo one in the middle, and I have 2 of these. So I set them up next to each other, and then I would use them as surfaces. You can do this. It just takes a little bit of effort, and it's kind of tricky because they usually don't have a very big surface area, which means you have to keep your shots really tightly focused. For example, a few inches higher towards the top of the teapot in this picture, there's no more placemat. It's just the table underneath. So they can be tricky, and I would definitely recommend the surface options we talked about in the last lesson, as opposed to using placemats as surfaces. But under the right conditions, you could add a placemat on top of your surface in the same way you would add a napkin on top of the surface, and that can add a little bit of depth that works under certain conditions. Another thing I use in a lot of shots are utensils, and this is an area where you probably have everything you need already, just some forks, some knives, maybe a big wooden spoon, or whatever makes sense with the type of picture you're trying to take. And I use these in 2 ways. The first is I'll set a fork next to the side of the plate, which kind of signifies that the place is set, it's ready to be eaten, and that tells a more realistic story. The other way I use them is, as you can see in this shot, where there's actually food on the utensil, and it's more of an action shot. So usually when I'm doing a photo shoot, I'll do most of my pictures, and I'll think I have everything I need, and then at the end, I'll pick up a utensil, put some of the food on it, and then take a few extra shots. Every once in a while, like with these pancakes, it comes out really well. Usually it doesn't, but it's a nice creative option to have access to, and using utensils helps you get these shots. So this was just a quick rundown of some of the more common props and accents that I use. These last few that we talked about are specific permanent things that you can add to your collection. So while these are nice and they add depth and they can really make your pictures look better, I think the most valuable prop that we've talked about is the one in the first slide, the one where it adds information. Something like the cashews to describe the cashew milk, or the peanuts to describe the peanut butter cookies. Always try to incorporate an element of the dish that really highlights what it is that the viewer is looking at. And then, if it makes sense, add some of these other permanent elements, like a napkin underneath the dish or a utensil to the picture. Now, talking about all of this, it might seem like it's absolutely essential that you add something to your picture, but it's not. It's totally okay to style your picture with no props and no accents. The upside of this is that you get a very clean picture, and the downside is basically all the reasons we just talked about, that there isn't going to be as much information and probably not quite as much depth. Like if you look at this potato gnocchi with a pumpkin Alfredo sauce made out of cauliflower, none of that is really obvious. If you really know what gnocchi looks like, you might know that this is gnocchi, but you certainly don't know that the yellowish orange sauce on top is a pumpkin Alfredo sauce made out of cauliflower. So if you don't need your viewer to understand what's in the picture exactly, or if you're able to provide a detailed description of what it is along with the picture, then in some cases you can go really, really simple and stylistic and use nothing. And that's a perfectly valid option, and whether you add a lot of things to your picture or nothing, just do it intentionally and understand what type of story you're trying to tell and what kind of response you're looking to get from your viewers. In your homework for this lesson, it would be nice if you could gather a collection of permanent accents that you can use for food photography. These would be like special utensils, or some of the napkins we talked about, maybe a piece of burlap. Just a few things that you can use to add depth and dimensions to your pictures whenever you feel like it's needed. You should also look at a whole bunch of examples of where accents were and were not used appropriately. Now, I've mentioned Food Gawker a number of times, and I kind of want to take a moment out to explain why it's such a valuable resource for food photographers. At Food Gawker, users, mostly food bloggers, submit pictures to Food Gawker, and then a professional editor on the back end looks at all of these pictures and only selects the best ones to display every day. So if you log on to Food Gawker, you can see a listing of hundreds or thousands of the best pictures right there on one screen. Just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. You can see all the really, really good pictures. That's why it's such a valuable resource for a photographer who's learning. You can look at so many examples and get so many ideas right there on one page in just a few seconds. So check out Food Gawker and just look at each picture for a few seconds and see if there are any accents in the picture, what they're doing there. Maybe it's a napkin and it adds dimension. Maybe it's a piece of fruit that describes the fruit smoothie, or whatever it is. See where they're used appropriately and where maybe there should be more accents or where they could have improved. And that'll help you a lot as you take your own pictures. At this point, we've finished the third section of the course on setting up your scene, and next we're actually going to pick up the camera and start taking some really good pictures. But if you stopped right here, the quality of your pictures would improve so dramatically. Think of everything you've learned so far. We learned how important it is to tell a story. We've learned some tips on how to tell that story. We've learned how to style food, how to choose the right dish, how to make sure your style fits within your story. We've learned about seeing like a camera. We've learned how to light our scenes appropriately. We've learned how to make and set up beautiful surfaces to take our pictures on. And now we've learned how to add accents and other elements that give our photos depth and more dimension. So at this point, you have so many valuable skills that'll make your pictures look great. And that's why we took the time to go over all of this stuff first, because now when you pick up a camera, it'll be so easy. You just have to frame your shot and take a bunch of pictures. And they're almost always going to look good because you know how to put the time into your scene and into your styling that'll take amazing pictures every time. So congratulations on making it this far, and from here, I promise it gets so much easier and you're going to have a lot of fun taking beautiful pictures.